Hey everyone, welcome to the Anexinet, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 34, recorded June 13th, 2018. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions at Anexinet, and here on the Anexinet, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we'll be looking at disaster recovery and how the hybrid cloud both enables new approaches and possibly creates new challenges with the CTO advisor himself, Mr. Keith Townsend. Welcome to the show, Keith.
Thanks for having me, Ned.
Absolutely. So before we dive into the topic at hand, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in this crazy world of technology?
Oh, wow. That's a long story since that was plus 20 years ago, man. I've always loved, like a lot of people in tech, especially someone who probably listened to this podcast, cut my teeth on the TRS-80. And ever since then, I've fallen in love with this. My first real job in IT was working the help desk at a financial services company. And that was the third shift. I kind of fell in love with the enterprise IT side of technology, studied for the MCSE, blah, 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 blah. 20 years later, here we are.
Wow. Okay. And now you're functioning as the CTO advisor. So kind of what's that about?
Yeah, so I had a little detour from outside of IT, I guess you could say. I spent a couple of years at PwC as a management consultant. That's a little bit outside of IT, traditional IT.
Sure. Where,
we looked at problems from the business side. So once I left PwC, I kind of looked around and said, you know what, I'm not a virtualized geek anymore. That was my old Twitter handle. I was focused on, VMware technologies, VMs, virtualization, speeds and feeds. After spending a couple of years as an enterprise architect and a couple of years as a management consultant, I no longer talked about speeds and feeds. I talked about these higher level solutions where enterprise architects, CTOs would care about kind of that conversation. So I shifted focus from doing pure speeds and feeds and technologies, connecting wires, to talking about the impact to business operations and overall architecture. That kind of took off. And within that journey, I decided to start the CTO advisor, which is the IT strategy / marketing, IT marketing company.
Okay. Very cool. And, what we're here to talk about today is disaster recovery. And I really to frame that up a little bit, let's level set and say, what do you consider is in scope for disaster recovery? And how does that term fit into the larger business continuity conversation? So
I think, one, you have to start the conversation at BC, business continuity. DR is a subset. It's part of the business continuity plan, basically saying, you know what, here's our business. This is what we need to do to continue as a going concern. Here are the risks to the business. And one of those risks may be technology related. And so your ability to execute, let's say, payroll or paying your vendors or order to cash. And that is a very technology-heavy, laden process. Disaster recovery focuses on the technology portion of business continuity. Business continuity talks about, on a higher level, saying, okay, if technology isn't available, if people aren't available, if the facilities aren't available, if there's a disruption in government, if there's a disruption in geography from some type of natural disaster, what have you, how do we continue business operations? That's business continuity. DR is talking specifically in our industry about how do we recover from a technology outage as a result of a BC incident.
Right. I mean, That's exactly how I think of it as well. Is business continuity is the big picture. It's shuffling around the people and process and all those larger components. And DR is just a subset in there. When I think about disaster recovery, I like to break it into three broad categories that you need to really nail to have a solid DR practice, and that's having the right technology in place, having the people that can actually execute that technology, and having processes, well-defined processes that the people can follow along with the technology to actually get DR to work. So does that breakdown make sense to you, or do you have another way that you tend to think of disaster recovery in that context?
No, I think that's the trap that a lot of people fall into. They look at the technology. The technology part of DR is really not that complicated. It is all about where you see DR fall on its face is people and process.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Because we're technology people, we tend to focus on the technology side of things because that's the new and shiny. But at the end of the day, somebody has to operate that technology properly to actually get the solution to work.
Yeah, someone has to operate the technology. Users have to be able to access it. Users need to understand if any changes in accessing your network changes. Someone needs to orchestrate the enactment of a DR. There's a lot of moving parts. I think we get caught up in the fun because the underlying technology to disaster recovery, what we do to make it possible, is really cool stuff like site-to-site replication, VM orchestration, instantiation. We'll get into that, I think, later on. But all of that is really, really cool computer science problems.
Right.
But again, if, going back to why we do DR at all, if, you have a manufacturing system that does PO, that, creates a PO and then there's a work order and et cetera. If you can recreate that manually with paper for a period of 3 or 4 days and run with that process, then all the technology in the world really doesn't matter. You've already kind of have a built-in process. It's how important is that system to the overall functioning of the business. So we can get caught up in, protecting stuff that doesn't really need to be protected as much as we think.
Yeah, I worked retail for a number of years prior to getting into IT, and registers going down was not an uncommon occurrence, and we just had our manual process that we would spin up to keep taking transactions and letting people pay for goods, and then when the registers came back up, we'd just kind of manually enter everything back in. But that was our DR, if you will.
Right. It's amazing. Business happened before technology. Business can happen after technology. It might be a little bit slower or a little less convenient.
Right.
But the whole point is to be able to assess what's important and protect those things that's important.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, I mean, disaster recovery always gets listed as a top priority when they poll CTOs and CIOs, but the funding for disaster recovery never seems to increase commensurate to that being a top priority. And often it seems like DR gets cut as a first pass at saving costs. So, thinking in that vein, is disaster recovery really that important, and who is it actually important to?
So I like to think about these things in the same vein as email.
Okay.
I'm sure you see a lot of folks in the field. I'm sure you still run across people who are still on Exchange 2003.
It has happened, yeah.
Yes, and it's not because email isn't important. It's because we failed to prioritize it and give it its level of importance. So, or even, for those of us in the networking field, a core data center switch, like that's completely invisible to the end user.
Right.
If you've ever had to make the business case for upgrading a core data center switch, super hard business case to make, because you go to a business user and you say, we need to upgrade this switch, and then they say, wait, hold on, Am I not receiving my email from Exchange Server 2003? Am I not? What new functionality are you? There's nothing sexy about it, but extremely critical. If you don't do it, you'll have this technical debt to pay, and you have this risk to the business.
Right.
So while we may not make it a priority because it is invisible, and we'll get into risk mitigation and how you measure that, I think, a little bit later on in the conversation. I think it's ranked high amongst CTOs because it's what keeps them up at night, and they know the investment isn't there. And that's what's, that's probably why it's high on the list of concerns.
Right. So you said, DR isn't sexy, right? Or email isn't sexy, but how does the CTO get the rest of the business pumped about it? How do we bring sexy back to DR?
So you'll never bring sexy back to DR. That's just not going to happen.
Fair enough.
But what you do is, you can go one or two ways. Some people like to go the fear-based way. Some people like to make a business case. So this is going to vary from company to company. But somehow, most companies, even my little small CTO advisory firm, we categorize projects and risk, etc. We have some type of formula for how do we decide whether or not we're going to invest in a particular area. If a marketing person called me and said, Keith, I can get you X amount of dollars in revenue if you spend $10,000 with my agency. And then my COO comes to me and says, you know what, Keith, we need to protect the website, and that's going to cost $3,000 to do. I have a business decision to make. Do I spend $10,000 on the marketing, which I can see that's sexy, that's increased revenue, that's great? Do I spend $3,000 to ensure that my core product stays available? This is where IT folks need to roll up their sleeves, get involved with the business, whether you have a formal business continuity department. If you have a formal business continuity department, then you don't need any help from me on getting funding from DR. Your business already understands the value of DR because you have the higher operating piece of BC.
Right.
If you don't have that, then you need to start the conversation there. You need to start to quantify the risk and opportunity of having DR. I got a call from a company about a month and a half ago, a potential client, who said that, you know what, we have a SaaS service that services X thousand number of small businesses. It went down. We didn't have a DR plan, and it was down for 36 hours. Completely disastrous.
Mm-hmm.
If I were the IT manager, if I were the enterprise architect, it would have been my job to highlight that risk and say, you know what, there's a 20% probability, there's a 5% probability. I can look at, say, we're all in AWS. AWS went down for a day last year. If our business is on AWS and it was down for a day, this is hypothetical because it wasn't down for a day last year.
Right.
If our availability zone was down for a day, which that happens, what's the impact to our business? And put that information in front of the business decision makers, and they can decide, you know what, I can take that punch in the eye and it's not really that big of a deal. Or, wow, our product and our reputation and our delivery, our service depends so heavily on technology that if we went down for a day, then it'd be disastrous. It varies from company to company.
Right. So it sounds like as a IT practitioner, one of the things you need to do is kind of understand the business side of the business you're supporting and help them put together a business impact assessment of, here's sort of the core things and core applications that you run. What does it cost you per minute or per hour to not have that service available? What is that worth in real dollars? And then just present it to the business side and hopefully to someone that has a fiduciary responsibility to the company and let them make that final decision on whether to fund the disaster recovery project or not.
Yeah, and from a So it can be as complicated as a business impact analysis, or it can be as simple as a conversation of you going to the CFO's office if you're in a relatively small organization, and actually say, you know what, Bob, and I'm using a real name here. I had a CFO named Bob.
Okay.
You say, Bob, you know what happens is if our data center is down, an order to cash is not available for 36 hours, because that's what it takes for me to recover from a physical outage of the data center. And Bob does a mental calculation that says, you know what, an order to cash, for those of you who don't know, is a process of when someone picks up the phone, talks to a customer service representative, and then whatever you sell from that point to the point that you're paid for the service, that's a whole process. So you should understand that process. So you can go to those business line owners. The first one can be the CFO and say, you know what, Bob, if we didn't have the ability to accept cash for 36 hours, 1 week, whatever you think your current capability to recover from a disaster would be, what would be the impact of the business? And that it will either frighten Bob, or Bob will say, you know what, that's not a big deal, etc. So as you look through your applications and your processes, the things that you've labeled mission critical, what happens if those technologies aren't available? Who does it impact in your business? And then you go to have conversations with those people.
Right, and not everything in the environment is going to be mission critical. So, you get those varying levels of protection based on what's the actual business impact if that system's unavailable.
Exactly. So, if you're like, sometimes we look at the logging system as not mission critical.
Right.
However, if you work in a FDA type of environment, that is critical. Mm-hmm. The inverse can be true. You would say that, you know what, email is mission critical almost everywhere. But there are some places where, you know what, if I don't get email for 2 or 3 days, it's really not a big deal. If you work on a rig somewhere where real-time communication or near real-time communication isn't important, you're already cut off from the world, and you may not communicate with your coworkers for weeks or months at a time, then you know what? Email in that situation isn't mission critical.
Right. Or you might have a situation where you're a super modern company and you're doing everything over Slack or something. No one uses email anyway.
And if an email comes in, it's more than likely a spam message.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. So you recently made a series of 1-minute videos on your YouTube channel, CTO Dose, that talked about DR and hybrid cloud. So kind of to unpack that a little bit, what is it about hybrid cloud that changes the equation for disaster recovery?
So normally when we think of disaster recovery, and we didn't really get into the conversation of RPO, recovery point objective, recovery time objective.
Sure.
One of the conversations, one of the results of the conversation is that you kind of get a sense with two things. How much data can I lose? And how much time does it take to recover the system? Mm-hmm. The how much data can I lose is RPO, recovery point objective. So if I'm in a real-time transaction, if I'm Amazon and I'm taking tens of thousands of orders a second, then I really can't afford to lose any data, because if I lose any data, I've lost transactions, I've lost business.
Right.
Versus, you know what, I'm a low transaction firm. I'm let's say the CTO advisor. I get one PO every week. I can afford to lose weeks worth of data, of PO data, and it doesn't impact my business. So what we, as technologists, one of the things that we always rush to do is say, you know what, I need to have real-time replication from one data center to another data center. I need to have the ability to spin up workloads as soon as there's a failure, so I need to have a recovery time objective of 5 minutes. If data center A goes down, data center B comes up. Now you may be a small business and you may actually have that business requirement. However, you simply can't afford it.
Right.
The having a hot site, having real time replication, all of the overhead associated with secondary private data center, even if it's hosted, is too much to bear for most companies. Hybrid cloud or hybrid IT, when you look at these hyperscaler clouds or even some of the smaller, more regional cloud players, they give you the ability to pay as you go and have DR as a service. And so you take this pay as you go model for smaller organizations. It really opens up this RPO, RTO capability of around 15 minutes or less for the average customer. It makes it within reach financially.
Right. And to put that into context a little bit, like traditionally, if you wanted real-time replication for your disaster recovery, you were probably doing like array to array, storage array to storage array replication, which that technology was very expensive. And you had to have the same exact array in both locations, which meant that you had to rent space or own space in that second location. You had to have a rack of gear ready to go, or a rack of gear that you were renting from a colo. So really low RPOs and RTOs were extremely expensive. But now you're saying, like, with hybrid cloud, you don't necessarily have to pay for all that gear and licensing and the specialized storage arrays, right?
Yeah, in theory, let's say that you have replication software installed on your, not even on your individual host. Let's say you have replication software installed on your array or your backup software that's taking 15-minute increments, snapshots of your infrastructure, and that replicates out to S3-based storage, object-based storage in the cloud or block-based storage, whatever the medium. Mm-hmm. That is relatively cheap. You're not paying for compute. You're just paying for storage. And in the case of an actual event, you just need to hydrate that data. So if it's object storage, you need to copy it to some type of faster block storage. And then you need to spin up the virtual machines. And in theory, you're up and running. So for the time that you're not leveraging your DR facilities, you're only paying for the cost to replicate the data and the cost to host the data. You're not paying for all of that idle compute.
Right, yeah, and I know that's a big thing, especially in DR, is like 99.999% of the time, you're not using that DR facility at all. So it's just sitting idle, but you're paying for it. And every time the CFO gets that bill, they're like, oh, I feel like I'm just throwing money away.
Even if you're in a shared DR facility, there's this... You're paying for guaranteed availability in case of a DR event. So that becomes a premium, whereas hyperscaler clouds in specific have the ability to say, you know what, for most of us, if we have to spin up 200 or 300 workloads within a half an hour period, that should be plenty of capacity, and hyperscalers can handle that with no problem.
Right, yeah, they just have that spare capacity all the time, and you're only paying for the capacity once you actually spin up stuff to use it. So like you said, you're just paying for the storage otherwise.
Right.
And that storage is really not that expensive, especially I know there's different tiers of storage in Amazon and Azure. If it's something that you don't have to recover super quick, you just need it to be there, you can go to that lower tier of storage that's even less expensive.
Yeah, like if you don't need, they've now started to offer lower tiers of even S3 object storage, where it's just a little bit less resilient. Mm-hmm. You just need the data to be there. It's going to always be available. It just may not be as resilient, which is for DR copy, depending on your RPO, RTO, might be perfect. And it might put you in that sweet spot for pricing.
Right. So you made mention a few times in the video of the process of converting the replicated data or hydrating the replicated data to cloud resources and then orchestrating the resources into sort of a functioning application. So can you unpack that idea and what's sort of involved in doing that?
So from a simple process, just thinking of it simply, everyone is, well, I don't know if I can say that everyone anymore. I'm getting old. I remember the P to V process of where we took physical data centers and converted them into virtual machines.
Sure.
Then there's V to V, virtual machine to virtual machine migration. So if you've ever done a Hyper-V to VMware migration, or VMware to Hyper-V, or VMware to KVM, there's some process in which you need to convert the virtual machine format into another format. Mm-hmm. From a basic sense, there is no universal. Got to be careful with that because people will pick with me. But the hypervisor that exists and the hypervisor and control plane that exists in AWS or Azure or Google Compute is going to be different than what you have on premises. So most people are going to be vSphere something or Hyper-V something. Right. You just can't take that VMDK or VDK. You just can't take that hypervisor file, put it onto the cloud, and hit the power button, and it just magically boots up. Just from the most basic, there's more complexity than that in orchestrating and starting up a VM. But taking a VM and making it a AWS AMI in which you can actually run the VM in the cloud is not always simple, depending on what you have available to you.
Right. Yeah. So once we get the resources, say the VHD or VMDK converted to, Amazon machine image format, let's say, and we're ready to spin up that VM, my work still isn't done, right? There's a little bit more to it than just getting a VM up.
Yeah. We think about the basic differences of cloud. The networking is different. The access to the network is different. Your infrastructure itself the infrastructure of your infrastructure has to come up. So let's think of a basic service that needs to be available before you boot up any app. You got to have up Active Directory. So right. Active Directory has to come up before anything else can come up.
Sure.
DHCP has to come up, in the case of, let's say, VDI. Your time services need to be available. DNS needs to be available. So you need to orchestrate the startup of your actual infrastructure. Then there's the orchestration of the starting up of applications. So databases, in most environments, databases need to be the first thing that comes up and becomes available. Then application servers, then web servers, then the networking in between. In our data center, we may have a complex network that has several IP address layers, IP address scheme for production, IP address production databases, a different one for PCI environments, et cetera, et cetera. So our data centers are not flat networks.
Right.
Those networks, the routing in between those networks, all of that has to be recreated in the public cloud. And that's assuming you don't have any applications that require layer 2, which is not available in any of the public clouds natively.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a lot of stuff to stand up before you can even get that first application up and running. But I would say, fortunately, all of the public clouds have a lot of automation tools built into them. So is that something that you think people should leverage when they're trying to build out that DR environment?
So when one of my insights from doing the 1-minute video series is that a lot of the effort needed to do DR in the public cloud, if you're not going with kind of a turnkey solution that does it for you, mm-hmm. is doing a cloud lift and shift project. So you have to go through, do application inventory, do an infrastructure inventory, design a solution around the public cloud of choice. And then you can use something like CloudFormation, Terraform. There's a ton of automation solutions out on the market. You can even go with a vendor solution like VMware vRealize to start to automate that whole process.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things you need to think through very carefully, and that is the instantiation of the environment is one thing. So you can design, and this is where people have a lot of challenge with DR, especially in the cloud. You can spend an awful lot of time designing the orchestration for starting up your environment in the cloud. And the day after, 15 minutes after you've tested it for the first time and it's successful, it will break the next day you test it because your environment is dynamic and it changes constantly. So while on paper, the scripting and the orchestration that you can do out of the cloud services vanilla work out the box, it's maintaining, and this is where that people and process part of DR becomes hard. Maintaining those processes and maintaining the state of your environment across that orchestration becomes the challenge.
Right. So one approach that I've kind of talked about is if you're going to automate your disaster recovery environment, then you should probably automate your production build because one can then directly feed into the other.
And I think you've kind of hit where I come from a advice perspective is don't make cloud or DR in general. Don't make DR a different operating model in your production. So even if you're not talking about hybrid cloud, one of the things I'm not a fan of, on paper, it makes sense, but I've had to go through this pain. On paper, it makes sense to say that in standard production, in a non-DR event, everyone uses laptops, desktops, full OSs, and have complete access to systems directly from their laptops. In DR, it's very tempting to say that we're going to do VDI because technically it's very clean, very easy to do.
Right.
In an actual DR event where a user has to access their system in a way that they're not accustomed to accessing their system, it's going to be disastrous. I promise you, DR events themselves are not as clean as when we write them on paper.
Right.
While the solution is technically sound, operationalizing that becomes very difficult. So I'm a big fan of saying whatever you do in production, do the same thing in DR. Whatever you do in DR, do the same thing in production so that operations are consistent and you have a better shot at keeping them in alignment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like we talked about the people and process is a big part of it. And if you have to have a completely separate training and process for how people will interact with their systems in a DR situation versus production, I mean, for starters, they're probably going to forget everything you told them because, it's not important to them until it's really important. So I think that's one big issue. And the other one is you're not going to keep that process up to date as production keeps changing. So you need that sort of feedback loop of every change I make in production necessarily makes a change in my DR plan.
Yeah, we had, even when we're doing, I've been in environments where we were doing, like, if you're familiar with the Dell EMC portfolio, VMAX, up until the most recent Dell Technologies world was the top of the heap for availability and Max. It was the boss of the Dell storage portfolio.
Sure.
Down to Power Max. And I've been in an environment where we were replicating VMAX to VMAX, just trying to eliminate risk as much as possible. And stupid stuff like keeping config files in sync on the local disk, on the local individual storages, and the local individual servers became the downfall to DR testing. Or some application setting that was manual, like stuff completely out of the enterprise IT or concern. Like when an application first comes up, a user has to do this 18 steps to begin to instantiate the system. So this is something that IT doesn't even do, and that users only have to do anytime there's maintenance on the system, which only happens once a year. So those are the types of things that break in DR. So you want to limit the change as much as possible.
Right. And I think you brought up another good point a few times, is that like what you have on paper may look absolutely perfect, but when you actually try to put it into practice, you realize all the steps that you might have forgotten, or there's caveats or things that are different in reality than what you planned. So how often should companies be practicing their DR, and what's a good way of making sure that that paper document actually reflects reality?
So the recommendation will vary. I fought to do DR testing at some level, whether it's what we call a technical test, where we just say, okay, is the technology itself feasible, versus full-blown DR tests where we get users involved and we have them connect to the DR systems. Where you get users involved and they connect to the DR systems and validate the test, that should happen once a year. Where you do technical tests, you should do that as much as you can budget from a people time process. So if you have a very simple environment, very turnkey, and you can test DR from a technical perspective, just say, you know what, I can spin up the workloads in the cloud. I can test my backups. I can do that once a month. It's not super expensive, and it's, kind of fairly easy. Do it once a month. You're in a more complex environment, and it actually takes a few hours of your people's time. Once a quarter might be more appropriate. Now, to validate the testing document, the chances that the people enacting the DR are the same people that wrote the policies is fairly low. The people who wrote the policy may not be the ones enacting the policy. So it's best to get someone else to follow your directions. So it could be, if you're a Active Directory administrator and you're responsible for recovering AD, it may make sense to get the Exchange team to go through to be the ones to bring up AD using your documentation. So, you don't have to contract a third party to do that, but you should get someone who's familiar with technology, but not as familiar with your actual discipline. And they have to follow the documentation to do the recovery.
That's an excellent point. And in a real disaster, you might not be available. If you're the guy who knows Active Directory, you might not be available for whatever reason during that disaster. So, your plan does have to be clear enough and straightforward enough that somebody who's, technically savvy but not you is able to actually follow it.
Yeah, like if your area has flooded and you have no comms, it's not that you don't have an ability to go to the office. I'm more than happy to bring up the system. I can't even connect to the web to get to the remote data center. I have no RAS.
Right.
I have no ability to get to the system to recover it. I can talk to somebody over the phone. You may not even have phone capability. So, especially if you contracted the solution out to a third party. If you contracted the solution out to the third party, you should be having DR tests until you're confident that the third party can execute the process. And there's not even a guarantee that, if you have a managed service provider, that you're going to get the same person that you've tested with for the past 2 or 3 times to actually enact the DR.
Right. So to a certain degree, we're trying to pull the people out of the process as much as possible, and just make it very streamlined and assembly line.
Yeah, you want to, it's like any other process, whether it's manufacturing or in IT, you want to automate what can be automated. You want to make that, you want to take people, if you're still building 20 servers a month by hand, then you probably are getting a lot of support tickets as a result of just human error. That's one of those things. If I'm building 20 servers a month, it's worth the time to just automate that process, take human error out of it. The same thing with DR. A basic example, like we've gone through I think almost everyone has gone through a period where either the IP address to your VPN has changed or the DNS to the VPN has changed, and you needed to communicate that out to end users. Just think what will happen in a DR scenario if that document isn't up to date, or that process is a manual process and it needs to be communicated out manually. Those are the types of things that you want to look through your process and say, how can I eliminate that risk, that people risk out of this this process?
Right. Yeah. Let's see, starting to sort of wind down a little bit. One other thing I wanted to touch on a little bit is we're mostly talking about traditional applications that are running in your data center today. But, we talked about hybrid cloud earlier, and there are newer style applications that are quote unquote cloud native. So they're designed in different ways. So are there considerations that you need to take when you're designing disaster recovery for these newer cloud native type applications?
Yeah, cloud native is a funny word. You go to Docker, and it's not just Docker talking about it now. Everyone is talking about modernizing an app by taking a legacy application, putting it inside of a container, and then running it inside of a container. And they call that cloud native. If you're talking about that level, then what we do traditionally will continue to work. You're still relying on more or less the infrastructure for resiliency. Mm-hmm. When you get away from applications that rely on the infrastructure, or you don't have access to that infrastructure, so you've built a Lambda-based application that's event-driven, completely cloud-native, there's no reliance on your infrastructure, now it becomes a much more difficult challenge to protect those applications. Not that the cloud providers don't have the capability, is that we don't have the processes in place to design the infrastructure for resiliency. This is up to this point has been an infrastructure focused conversation. So as CTO, as an enterprise architect, as a application level architect, the protection starts at a different level. Now we're actually talking about designing resiliency into both the application and the infrastructure to an extent. So from a enterprise architect, from the CTO perspective, you're creating standards to say that if your application falls into this line of business criticality, you're going to use this layer of, and this takes some work on the back end. One, you need to design a storage policy that says if it's this application, you're going to do, let's say, S3 replication from this availability zone to that availability zone, so that AWS replicates the data. Or you can go the other route, and this is, again, both are valid directions to go. You can say that the application does the replication. And this is the design this is your policy in building apps. The reason why I make a big deal of this is because when you're a small environment and you make one or two custom cloud native apps, really not a big deal. But when you're a large enterprise and you have 2 or 3 dozen cloud native apps and they all use some different underlying technology or process to do DR, then it makes it extremely difficult to operationalize DR and to even perform DR testing. So if you have 3 or 4 cloud native apps that work in conjunction to deliver a business process, and all 3 use 3 different DR methodologies or resiliency methodologies, and you need to enact a DR test, how do you even write that test?
Right, that's pretty challenging.
Yeah, it becomes a operational challenge. So don't let the cloud become a wild, wild west when it comes to DR. You have to think this through about how am I going to, and this is not, I'm preaching to the choir with a CTO and enterprise architect audience, but this is where processes for large enterprises come into play. I used to, early on in cloud, I used to get my hand slapped and people would tell me, let people do whatever they want in the cloud. Well, at the end of the day, someone has to support it.
Right.
And this DR is just one consideration.
Right. So don't let the hybrid cloud fool you. You still need your ops.
You still need
get
your
stuff
ops.
done. Well, I think that's probably a good note to end on. Keith, if people want to know more about you, what you're up to, follow you, where do you blog, post, etc.?
So I'm prolific on LinkedIn. That's probably where you're going to find me the most with this related content. But obviously, I create a lot of video content, which you can also find on LinkedIn. But you can also find the video content on ctodose.com and the blog thectoadvisor.com.
Okay, great. And I'll put links in the show notes to all of those. Last question, I like to ask this for everyone who comes on the show. What is your favorite 80s movie?
Oh, that's a tough one. I like a whole lot of them. I'm gonna go a little obscure and say Goonies.
Goonies, good. That's a good call. I always like to go with the gut. Whatever comes to your mind first. That's what you go with.
That's the hey you guys.
Awesome. Well, Keith Townsend, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for appearing on the Anexipod.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks for having me.
And that was our show with Keith Townsend. Thanks to the marketing team for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Anexinet for helping me produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital transformation, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet, see how they can help. If you've enjoyed this episode of Anexipod, why not leave a nice review on iTunes? If you're looking for more content, you can check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow. On the show, I am joined weekly by my co-host, Chris Hayner, to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. You can find out more about me and what I'm up to on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.